Hello and welcome to a Synoptic question for psychological factors screencast. So we're going to have a look then at potential kind of synoptic questions linking skill acquisition and sports psychology areas of the specification. So if I just ask you now very quickly, have a look and think, these are all your areas that, so basically the parts would have to be split up into things from skill acquisition, which is all your stuff here, and then sports psychology, all your stuff here. Now, these are not exhaustive lists of the specification. They are all in your revision packs, on the revision screencast. So it's just important now that you have a look and just think, they could come from this area. It's a good little revision task maybe. And then have a look over to this area for the other bit. We're going to have a look particularly then at the link between sports confidence and particularly Veely's model of sports confidence and feedback, okay, and see how those two could link together. So what we're going to do then, so we'll start off, have a look at exam title that you might get. So I'll put in red the bit we're going to focus on first. So using one sporting example, explain Veely's model of sports confidence. And then the second part of it is evaluate the impact of different types of feedback within Veely's model of sports confidence. Now, I think what's important here, the question could actually to evaluate the impact of different types of feedback used to raise confidence. Okay, it could be just evaluate the impact of within the model. So what I'm going to do is try and show you how you would do it within the model. So let's have a start then. Basically, when you see Veely's model, let's see if we can get through this bit first. Now, you can choose how you do this. I'm going to do it with the model first, then the feedback linking back to the model. It's completely up to you how you do this. So started off from here then. So let's have a look. One sporting example, if you remember, the one we've used in class is looking at a penalty. What you have to be able to do is every time you see a part of the model, you need to be able to kind of, when you see a part of the model, you've got to explain it, example it, explain it, example it, explain it, example it. These three interact to directly impact this, explain it, example it, which impacts this, explain it, example it, which impacts this, explain it, example it, and remember that goes off positive, negative, and then we look at how that will increase that, and a positive will lead to 3-4 knock-on effects, and negative will lead to 3-4 knock-on effects down here. So that's your first bit. I put stars here where I think feedbacks might intersperse with our writing. So let's have a look first of all. Let's get this model done. So Veely's model first of all measures trait, sports confidence, and competitive orientation. That's the first thing. That's what it measures. Now, what we need to do then is start to look at that first section that we talked about, the interaction of the three key factors. So if we're going down from here, the initial three key factors are trait, sports confidence. And this is a performance innate, stable and enduring predisposition to be confident in a wide variety of situations or sports. Second thing, objective sports situation. This is the specific sports situation that's happening. So, for example, taking a penalty, and that straight away, this is the one example we're going to use. And then on top of that, competitive orientation just simply refers to how competitive an individual is. For example, do they offer to take a penalty? For example, offering to take a penalty or volunteering to take a penalty. Now, these three factors, obviously, if I'll just talk for a second before I put the kind of the writing on. If you're thinking now, that makes sense, doesn't it? If you're thinking about this now, how confident you are in a wide variety, or your innate predisposition or innate stable enduring predisposition to be confident in a wide variety of sports, alongside how competitive you are in life. Do you volunteer to do stuff? And then on top of that, you place that with a situation such as taking a penalty. Those three factors are hugely influential in how confident you are when you for the specific confidence of taking a penalty. And of course, these three factors then, once they've determined the level of state sports confidence. Remember, we always circle that. S and S, because state sports confidence is a situation-specific confidence. So these three will interact that, because if you've got high of all these, this will then lead to, for example, state sports confidence, sports-specific situations, e.g. taking a penalty. That is a specific action within kind of the sport of football that we're going to use, because that's the example we said we're going to use all the way through. This then will directly impact the behavioural response. With our behavioural response, remember, is how competently we execute the skill. So, for example, in this case, I think I'll put it onto here. So, for example, how well the penalty is struck, how well you make contact with that penalty, or how to put it there. Okay, so that could be your next bit. Now, once you've done that, so now you think of those three things at the top of it, kind of influenced our situation-specific confidence of taking a penalty. That then has a knock-on effect on our behavioural response, how competently we strike the ball. Now, from that, of course, we get to the final part, which is looking at our outcome, okay, and our subjective outcome, and that basically looks at kind of our interpretation of whether the penalty is successful. Now, From here, okay, following that, remember there could be two things. If you score, we have a positive subjective outcome, and that has an impact on kind of our trait, sports, confidence, competitive orientation. So have a look onto here then. So first up, positive subjective outcome. Give an example, e.g. you scored that penalty, okay? That then will lead to an increase in trait, sports, confidence, competitive orientation. Okay, now that then, remember, because that's where the arrows go on the model. Following those, that will then lead to an increase in state sports confidence, self-efficacy, approach behaviour, and mastery orientation. So that is a good way of looking at it, to think that the generic confidence that is raised in the competitiveness then goes down to the specifics. So the next time you've got situation-specific, you don't have to explain these, but maybe just say situation-specific confidence, Bandora's version of situation-specific confidence. Next time a penalty comes, you're more likely to offer, and then you start to become more confident towards achieving mastery. Now, of course, the flip side to that is a negative subjective outcome. So if you miss the penalty, you interpret that it's poor or it's missed. Well, obviously, you're going to interpret it if it goes wide or the goalkeeper saves it. This can have a negative effect on trait sports confidence, okay, and competitive orientation, which then can have a knock-on to our four key things. State sports confidence can reduce, self-efficacy can reduce. We then develop something called avoidance behaviour, where we don't volunteer to take penalties in the future. And finally, it can lead to that condition where we deem failure as inevitable. So that is that kind of gives you kind of overview of Veely's model. So we've gone through each section and we've talked about positive and subjective outcomes and the impact they could have. Now, the next thing we've got to have a look at is how we can kind of apply feedback or evaluate the use of feedback at different points in the model, really. And hopefully, I mean, you might have started to see this. I think you can now do a set part 2. You've got the choice, really, of doing a part 2, talking about feedbacks and linking it back to different parts of the model. If you want to link it to confidence, you might just have positive aspects. I'm going to go through a number of the feedback types. So the first one then, I think if you look down at behavioural response. So the big thing for me when you're talking about behavioural response, this is the competence and the skill execution. That links nicely, I think, to the feedback of knowledge and performance, because that's to do with the kind of technical execution, isn't it? Okay, so I think knowledge and performance could be linked to or within the behavioural response. So, for example, the performer getting information on the technical execution. It's more relevant, okay, if it's going to be done intrinsically for autonomous performance, because they have a motor program for this, and it's not so relevant for cognitive performance because they don't actually have a motor program on what the successful skill should look like, okay? And it can lead to a decrease in confidence if they keep getting it wrong. The other side of this, of course, is the intrinsic feedback. If I was going to pick one out of the two, it'd probably be this one, because intrinsic feedback, of course, it is massively relevant to behavioural response and the competence and execution, because it is that concept of kind of using kinesthesis to feel whether you have a positive or negative contact with a penalty. Now, this is really effective because it allows you to detect your own detect your own errors. But of course, and the other thing is, it's really effective for autonomous performers because they have the motor program, but it's not so good for cognitive performance because they don't have the motor program. Therefore, they can't use it. Therefore, it can lead to a decrease in confidence. Now, going down from here, then we get down to the subjective outcome. Remember when we got here, we said this is the interpretation of your performance. So if you score a penalty, that then gives you knowledge of results. Okay, so knowledge of results could be used at the outcome of the performance. So, for example, score or miss. Now, the good thing about this is it's accurate and it's factual. Okay, you either score or you miss. However, we know that and it's statistically accurate, but it doesn't always develop or give you ways of developing knowledge of performance, because just because you scored a penalty, you could have dribbled it into the corner or dribbled it through the middle or the goalkeeper dived over the top of it. It doesn't actually tell you or help you with regard to developing your knowledge of performance, and it can be too based on statistics, which, and if you keep missing, it can actually decrease confidence. So try to keep mentioning confidence because this is a confidence model. Now, of course, we then get down to our last couple of things here. When you're talking about subjective outcomes, you have to have talked about positive subjective outcome and negative subjective outcome. So if you have a positive subjective outcome, e.g. you scored the penalty, I think that positive feedback could lead to those linked to those kind of positive subjective outcomes. For example, a coach praising for scoring. Now, this is most effective if it's specific, e.g. you scored because it went in the corner, and it's really effective for cognitive performance because it can raise confidence. However, it can lead to it's not always that effective, it's unspecific, and especially if it's overused because it can lose its effect. Now, I think now, personally, that would be enough. Now, bearing in mind you've got positive feedback, can also talk about extrinsic feedback in terms of your positive feedback. Those two work together. And I've put this one on there just because, you know, if you had a negative subjective outcome, lots of professional sports performers miss penalties, okay? And they would need to know why they missed the penalties from a coach, for example. So negative feedback could also be used if there's a negative subjective outcome. So remember that that concept of a criticism for incorrect performance. Now, this can be really effective if it's constructive, and particularly for autonomous performers, because they want to perfect their skills. However, it could be dangerous, okay, for if it's overused with cognitive performers, constant negative feedback that's not constructive, because it can lead to a real decrease in confidence, okay? And confidence obviously is something this model is trying to propose, that we want positive subjective outcomes. Okay, so if you were running out of time on this and it did come up as a 10-mark question, maybe you could leave the negative feedback out and try and give all of these like a positive slant, but then criticize it with the bits in red there. So hopefully you can see how that could work. I would certainly, I mean, you've got a choice, haven't you, really? Do you want to do the model and talk about kind of what it measures? If I maybe go back to this bit onto here then, I wonder if you did this bit, you got all of your answers down into here, down to there, and then when you got to your subjective outcome, okay, down to here, you might then talk about the feedback here. You might say, in order to understand the feedback type that could be linked to subjective outcome would be knowledge of results, because you either score or miss. This is as good because it gives you factual, statistic-based information. However, the statistics don't always help you develop your knowledge of performance, e.g. your technique. Then, when you got down to here, your next part of your answer, you could talk about positive subjective outcome, e.g. scoring a penalty. Okay, from this could lead to trait sports confidence, competitive orientation, and this in turn would do. You might say here, for example, a coach could use positive feedback here after the positive subjective outcome. You could put it here if you wanted to, okay, which is the use of praise when they scored the penalty. This is good if it's specific, e.g. the technique they used. However, it can be negative. I'm sure you can see how I'm going with this. It's up to you how you structure it. You might want to do some stuff on the feedback going in sequentially as you go down through the Veely's model, or you might just think that's too confusing. I just want to do Veely's model and do it the way I have, which is like this, and just talk about the feedback types and link it back to a part of the model. Now, hopefully that makes sense. Is it too long? I don't know. I think it could be done if you practiced it. You're not expected to do loads of evaluations for the feedback types if it was in a 10-mark question, but of course, it's an option. You are not getting 8, 9, and 10 without showing and demonstrating that you can evaluate. And I think what I've noticed so far from these kind of extended answer questions, they tend to put the command word evaluate in there. So if they're putting the command word of evaluate in the answer, feedback needs to be part of the feedback specification is advantages and disadvantages. Part of guidance specification is advantages and disadvantages. I think it's important that if it's got that in it, you're aware of how to do that and you feel ready to do it. Okay, thank you very much.